I'm Elaine Petrocelli, and I have the honor of introducing you to my friend Amy Tan. I first met Amy Tan when she wrote the Joy Luck Club, and when my mother called me to tell me that she was sure Amy was Jewish. Her conflict with her mother was just like my conflict, and I think a lot of people feel that way. I understand we have a in-store video feed, so if anybody is in the cafe or around the corner, you'll be able to see it too, and that's great. And afterwards, we're going to ask some questions, and we'll repeat the questions so people can know. I think that Amy is one of the treasures of our time. She writes books that are so beautiful and so mesmerizing that you never want to stop the book. It is a problem because with the Valley of Amazement, I found that no matter what was going on in the house or the store, I didn't give a damn. But we should not be overly surprised because of Amy's amazing body of work, from the Joy Luck Club to all of these other fabulous books like The 100 Secret Senses and The Kitchen God's Wife. And how many people saw the opera of The Bonesetter's Daughter? Wasn't that amazing? And to be able to write the libretto for a book that you have written, I can't even imagine what that took, but it was gorgeous. But this should be an opera too. It needs to be 4 operas, a series, because The Valley of Amazement is one of those books that you cannot forget. You will read it and want to start over because the characters and the pictures she paints are so beautiful. So Amy Tan, who won her first writing conference, I believe, in junior high school in Santa Rosa, is going to come out, and we're going to talk to her. Yeah. Thank you, Amy.
It was actually when I was 8.
You were 8, even more precocious. No wonder I'm jealous. So I'm so glad you're here and that you've written this amazing book. But one of the things that I had to ask myself when it first started was, why courtesan? What in the world made you, of all the great subjects you've chosen, why this one?
You know, it was a really unlikely subject for me. I would have been shunning that subject out of, thinking that it'd be like the stereotype of Sin City, Shanghai. But I became fascinated with this because of a photo that I saw. I was doing research on Shanghai. I'd been writing another book for 5 years, and I opened this book, and suddenly my heart stopped because the photo was, it was called The 10 Beauties of Shanghai. It was taken around 1911. And the 5 of the women in this photo were wearing clothes identical to what my grandmother was wearing in my favorite photo of her. And these women were courtesans. And my first thought was, wow, really popular outfit back then. No, I mean, that wasn't my first, but I was trying to think, why is she wearing, why is she wearing these clothes? And, among the many possibilities, I thought, well, it could be that she went to a studio with some friends and they thought it'd be really funny to do dress up. Mm-hmm. And you have to, in reading this and talking to people about this, you have to realize that the clothes were very specific. I don't have to tell you what these clothes were because I can show it to you. So if you could dim the light, I'll just show you what this looks like. So this is my grandmother in my favorite photo of her. And you see there's a headband that forms a V at the very top. Its headband has little pearls and some embroidery. The jacket is fairly tight. The collar goes up to just below the earlobe. The sleeves are tighter and end right below the elbow. They are have a white lining that goes to the wrists, matching bracelets type pants. Taken in a photo studio, what's called a Western photo studio, with a painted backdrop and pots of flowers. here is the picture that I saw in the photo book, the research book. So you see that there are 5 of them that have on clothes that were identical to what my grandmother's wearing. The headband is what caught my eye, and then I started going through it bit by bit and looking to see what was the saying. And reading about this, I found out also that courtesans were quite well known for innovating fashion. So some of these things, like the short and tighter sleeves, are what they created. Let me just also say what courtesans are, because I think a lot of people don't have a context, since we don't really have courtesans today. They're like geishas, only they were not as rigid in their protocols and their customs. As I said, they could innovate their fashions. They didn't have that, adherence to the Japanese details of the geisha. And they also were courted. They may have had, say, 5 or 6 suitors, and after a period of time, the courtesan didn't necessarily choose the most generous. It could be the cutest guy. That wasn't smart, though, because word got around that she wasn't playing fair. There were many men who actually complained publicly of being fleeced by a courtesan. The careers of these women started at age, say, 14 or 15, and it was over at about age 20, 21, 22. Very short career, and what you're dealing with are the emotions of a young girl, basically, for much of their career. So, there is your courtesan. That one there, by the way, is the most popular courtesan during that same period when my grandmother when she was, whatever she was doing, and wearing that costume.
And after being 22 and an old lady, what did courtesan do?
Well, she had to have a situation in place, and the wise thing she would have done is saved her money and either opened up her own house or had a place in somebody else's house, a rich man's house, as his concubine, say his first concubine, which would be the equivalent of his second wife. It was very rare for a courtesan become the first wife of a man. She would have really had to make him go crazy with love for him to do that. And they often really wanted to be part of a rich household, so they could have their needs taken care of in the manner to which they had become accustomed. The courtesan houses were very fancy, and they had Western furniture in them. The courtesans were known to have popularized Western culture, furniture, games, pool, spittoons, fashion details. They ride around in carriages and pairs and wave to people on the sidewalk like celebrities, and they were celebrities. Young girls would see them and faint. And sometimes they got arrested for having sex in the carriage and going. They were very daring. Some of them were very daring.
And speaking of sex, I've read all your books, and I have had beautiful love relationships, but sex has never been very specific.
Yeah.
But in this one, Violet peaks, and so do we, and we learn a lot about what goes on. How did you get yourself to do that?
Well, first, there didn't seem to be a need to include sex scenes, but I was always criticized by my writers group. I don't know if any of them are here. But I was always criticized by them. Molly Giles, is she here? Molly, are you here? Okay, well, Molly used to criticize me for not being able to write a sex scene. And but when I was writing this, after a while, she said, this does take place in a courtesan house. And, the idea, of course, is that they're not playing ping pong. So I had to include something, but I wanted to do it also in the context of business, that this was a business, and this was a business of illusions that they were creating about the illusion of love that would appeal to a man's ego. And also some of these men probably had some, specials that they liked. And we know that the techniques were different. We don't know what they are because that is lost to the ages. The tricks of the trade are actually not written down anywhere. So I had to experiment. No. we know that wives paid the courtesans for teaching them the techniques. And so what I did was, actually did research, and I went to read pornographic novels of the times. The famous one was Jim Carrey, The Plum and the Golden Vase. And it's known for being pornographic, but it was actually a very, very literary book. They reduced the literary stuff because people thought it was boring and you had to be very learned in order to understand it, and they left the sex in. And when I started reading that, thinking it would be useful, I thought, it's really not that graphic. It's not that bad. And it was almost sort of like he started to take her blouse off and then, Twilight of Desire fell over them or something. And then I found out I had the expurgated version. So I got another copy. There are many, many copies of this, but I got another copy, and that one was less expurgated, and it was instructional. I also read pillow books that were popular, and illustrations that were there that people kept in their pillow books. And I love the names of the aphrodisiacs. They were things like Gates Wide Open. That was my favorite, Gates Wide Open. And positions. There are like the 30 basic positions. And they'd be things like Phoenix flying over the oyster. You don't even have to describe what that is. Yeah. So that's my research.
At least in the book, the courtesans were very literate in that they did poetry and
there, and that was my research too.
There you go. There's a literate.
That's me.
Theme.
That was I played in the Rock Bottom Remainders for 20 years, and my getup, the one that they made me put on, was as the lead rhythm dominatrix. I was actually nervous that if I put sex in, people would think that I was simply describing
the Rock Bottom
that was
Remainders
happening. Yeah, that I've had people who think that this getup is really who I am. I had a publisher, actually, from Eastern Europe. We won't say which country, but Kafka would be embarrassed at first. He asked me, he told me after a performance that he'd been really bad and that I should come to his room to punish him. Yeah, really, oh God, yeah. Drunken guy. So not that my grandmother was a courtesan. I don't know these things, but if she had a customer like that, I really feel sorry for what she had to go through.
Amazing. This book is also about mothers and daughters, and that's a theme in so much of what you write. Could you talk a little bit about the abandonment that happens in this book?
I think that one of the greatest betrayals a mother could possibly do is to abandon her children. And you always wonder, is there any reason that a mother could do that and for it to be forgivable, understandable? Mm-hmm. In my own family, my mother was abandoned by her mother. I considered abandonment because her mother killed herself when my mother was 9, and my mother was at her bedside begging her not to leave. She was 9, my mother was 9 years old, and they had just moved into this house, joined this house. My grandmother is the 4th wife, and so this was a family of strangers. Eventually there were a total of 7 wives. Very rich man living on an island in a mansion, all these servants, all these people, and she was left alone. And she used to talk throughout her life about all the misfortunes and tragedies she could have avoided, including marrying a horrible man. She could have avoided these things had she had a mother. My mother said that, and yet when in 1949, she had tried to leave her husband a number of times and had been thrown into jail. But when she ended up leaving for the United States to be with my father, and she left 3 daughters behind. And my half-sisters and I have talked about this abandonment and what they believed and what they wanted to believe. That they also felt a lot of the unhappiness could have been avoided had their mother been there. That they also blamed her for a lot of the bad things that happened. They were sent to the countryside in China and worked in the rice fields, one of them for 19 years. So,
and you later
so that
were able to bring the
is,
family back together. How
Yeah.
did you do that?
Bring the family back.
Did you found your sisters? Right?
Well, my mother joined up with she met them again 30 years later, in 1979, when Westerners, Americans, were able to go to China again. And, by then she said that they were old ladies. One of them came over and moved to the United States. I saw her about a month ago when I was in Milwaukee. She comes and stays with us. I don't know if you've had a chance to meet her. Yeah, she comes and stays with us every year. And another sister lives in El Cerrito, and the other one is in Shanghai. So they're all doing fine, but they had a horrendous life during the Cultural Revolution. And in thinking about that theme of abandonment and betrayal, I can't think of very many upheavals that would be worse than to lose your mother and suddenly be cast into another world, having to make your way in that world alone. And that's what happens to Violet.
Yes. And Violet becomes a courtesan. I guess I'm not giving anything too much
You
away.
just ruined
Some of my favorite scenes were when she was being taught what she needed to know.
Yes. I was torn between this idea that throughout the story I'd be sprinkling her learning to do this or doing that for a customer, and I thought, she has a mentor, let's just get it out of the way. And here's what she has to know. And so there's a whole chapter, you can use it, the handbook, the etiquette.
In case you want a career.
Yeah, etiquette for beauties at the boudoir.
It's
A lot of it, though, it's not just about sex. I really think that it is more about illusions, the illusions and what they're based on. Illusions having to do with our sense of self, a man's sense of self, a nostalgia that he has for himself, that ideal person he was supposed to be, how he was supposed to really increase the character of his family, or that he would enhance the reputation of his business. All of these things, his moral character would have shown and been an example in society. Those things were what the courtesans would polish, polish up and said, you are that person. The illusions of love, I love you because you were all these things. So it was as much psychology that they had to know as much as anything. And that's written about in the literature, that they had to be very skilled in reading what it was that these men wanted to feel about themselves. They were in a social situation. Courtesan houses were not simply a place where men went and sat around giving gifts, looking at these courtesans. It was a social club. So, 6 men would go over, their buddies, they'd sit around, have drinks, play games, talk about how business was, and there would be courtesans in the room. It was like the Playboy Club.
But there was, in your book anyway, there was also an opportunity for the Caucasian man and the Chinese man to do business.
Yeah, that was a fiction. No, I mean, that we do have to make some things up. you know what, the reason why that is a fiction is in Shanghai during that period, Western men and Chinese men, or people in general, did not socialize. They lived together in the same community. There was a place called the International Settlement, and it was its own enclave. It was ruled by American law, enforced by British police, and the courtesan houses were located there because they were not under the same auspices of Chinese law that really made those houses illegal. So they were there as well, but I talked to people who lived there during that time. We said, your father was very influential. He worked with Chinese people at a very high level of government. Did you have Chinese friends? And she said, oh, no. And I said, did you ever, talk to a Chinese person? She said, only the servants, and we talked to them in pidgin. And that's what I had read as well. Mm-hmm. So it would take a real leap for Chinese person and a Westerner to get together. And I thought of what that leap would be. This was a period of intense foreign trade. The growth was explosive, and that's when Shanghai became such a big city. Why it became so cosmopolitan. People from around the world were going there to start these foreign trade businesses. You have this manufacturing company, I have this product, I have the market, you have the shipping line. And they were all getting together outside of the social situation. Well, I imagine that courtesans and women in these social clubs for men would be overhearing the conversations. The men would be talking openly about, we're going to do some price fixing next week, and thinking, those dumb women, they don't know what we're talking about. But of course, the women are very smart, and anyone who knows a Shanghainese woman knows that. I mean, Shanghainese women are all my Shanghainese friends are very clever and, smart. So they would have known all this, everything they were talking about, and they would figure out who needed to meet whom. And then the story, Lulu and her compatriot bring them together and make quite a good little business as connectors, as maidens of a sort.
Well, you may have made it up, but it just feels awfully true.
It would have been a great business, actually.
Could you talk a little bit about the trip to Moon Pond Village? And I can just see, it makes me very uncomfortable to think of that trip that Violet was on. But did you take that trip into out there?
Yeah, in fact, there's someone here in this room who went with me, Emily Patrick. Is she here? Oh, there she is.
She's
Emily
right there.
is here. Emily, I went 3 times, and Emily went with me the last time I was there, and it was one of the coldest places you can be. It was supposed to be eternal springland. It's in Guizhou, the poorest, most remote province in China. And it's absolutely beautiful, but it also in the fall it is hot, in the spring it is freezing, and you get an idea of what conditions people live under. We stayed in a place that was relatively comfortable compared to others because we had electric mattresses. They were in these homes some of them without floors. They had natural air conditioning year round because the wind would just blow through the planks of the walls. And I actually have a picture. No, I just one. I'll show you let's see if I can find it. There. That is where we were, and you don't see the rest of the village. The village, imagine these rooftops that are slightly curved at the end of the eaves with black tiles. So the tiles themselves have the look of a dragon, a quail, or a fish scales. And but as you walk through these rice fields, this is going into the foothills here where you see the rice terraces. And then you can wind your way up into this place, and almost everywhere you look, there'll be rice terraces. So we would walk up these little narrow paths, and what I wanted to do when I first went there, or the second time I went, is to meet a man and his family who had been banished. Their father had set fire accidentally and burned down the village. And by the code of the minority Dome tribe, they were banished and lived in this country. Banished for a period of three years or so. They made the sentence more lenient because they had young children and the children needed to be able to walk to school. They still wanted them to go to school. So
they were banished where?
they went to some land. They had to live at a distance of something like 3 to 5 kilometers away, and they had some land up there, and they had a cowshed, and that's where they lived, an abandoned cowshed. It was terrible, but you also have to imagine that the people down below lost their homes. They lived in things that were worse than that cowshed. You know, they were equally as bad. Very poor people. And so one of the things when you read this book, there's a journey that 3 women make through to get into Heaven Mountain. And there are spots in which they talk about looking down and thinking they were gonna, you know, they might get dizzy and fall into that. That's how I felt. I was going across some places during the fall when it was really warm. It was also rainy at times, and there was a lip that wound around the rice fields, the terraced rice fields in the mountains. It would be like this. There would be a rice field here and a lip, and then 20 feet below that would be another rice field. And that lip was very narrow. It was about this wide, and it's slippery, and I'm clumsy. I'm walking and looking down. Something you should never do. You learn when you're skiing never to look at what you're afraid is, because your skis are going to turn that way. It's the same with, you know, so when you read about how scared they were, that was my research.
How did you find this place?
A friend of ours has been working with the Dome people. They're a singing minority, and they wanted to record the music before it was lost. And they told us, you know, asked me if I wanted to go. Because Stuart Wallace, the composer of the libretto, I mean the opera, I wrote the libretto, asked him if he wanted to go, you know, investigate this place. So we all went, a bunch of us went for a few days, and then I decided to go back to write something for National Geographic. And that took 2 visits. It took 2 visits because I loved the place so much. I wanted to go back. So
I remember that National Geographic article, and I remember thinking, I'm never going there, and I am glad. It sounds beautiful, but it really scared me. It scared me. I thought, I could never do this.
It's a fairy tale land, isn't it, Emily?
Yeah.
It's a fairy tale land. It's so beautiful, and the bridges are beautiful, and the people are wonderful. It was, yeah, I would love to go back again. Unlike Moon Pond, see, I set that out, the illusion of Moon Pond was going to be that place. But when they get there, they find your nightmare. Instead, you know, it's cold, it's dirty, the people aren't happy.
Yeah. I think you're great adventurers. I really admire you and Emily and everyone else who went, because beautiful, yes, but I would look down, and then that would be the end. That would be the end of that. Could you talk a little bit about the title of this book without giving too much away? Because it's an unusual title.
I don't think there's anything that I'd be giving away, really. I mean, you see this beautiful valley. The Valley of Amazement is the title of a painting that I saw in the National Gallery in Berlin, where I went on a very quick tour. And in my hurry, I saw a number of landscapes by German painters. And one of them was called the Valley of Amazement, or das Tolles, whatever. And it was a valley with mountains on the side, and there was a storm, and it was hard to tell whether the storm was coming or whether it was going. It was clouds that were boiling, and you know, had some color variation, a clear area in the back. It was hard to tell whether it was dawn or dusk. But I had a feeling, you know, it was a sense of ambiguity, but it was more one that hinted at something very dark and that was going to happen. There was a figure, and it was not clear whether he was going there or leaving, whether he had to go there and he was dreading it, or leaving with relief. There was another painting that was done by Albert Bierstadt, a similar kind of thing. I think it was called Storm in the Mountains, Mount Rosalie. And again, a valley, mountain, storm, dawn or dusk. But that one felt more hopeful. I took the valley then to be metaphoric of many of these points of arrival that we have in our lives. When things are changing and we don't know what lies ahead, or we don't know if it's going to be good, if the bad things are going to go away, the storm is going to leave, whether the dawn will happen, a new day will happen, or the setting sun is going to go down and our lives are, it's going to be dark from then on. And I felt that so often. It could be even quitting your job, or whatever. So that picture was my metaphor. And that painting, there's a painting called The Valley of Amazement. It goes around 3 generations, and they all have their take on that painting. Yes.
And San Francisco is in this book, and I believe that's the first time we run into the artist.
Yeah, yes, the artist of the so-called Valley of Amazement, he is Chinese. There was a Chinese painter who studied in the United States for about 10 years, and for all these things, even though I could have made it up, I didn't find that there was a basis for seeing that it might have been possible. So I did find that there was a Chinese painter, and he was the first one to paint in the Western style, versus people who went to France and studied painting and took back parts of Western painting but continued to paint in the Chinese style. That became my painter, and Lulu falls in love with this guy. She is a romantic girl who lives with eccentric parents in San Francisco. She thinks that she needs to marry this guy. Okay, I did research there. About 1 out of every 20 Chinese men in San Francisco during that period married white women. Isn't that surprising? Yeah. Usually, though, they were, kind of the real low-class immigrant, like the Irish. They were Irish, believe it or not, very low. They were kind of same level as the Chinese back then. So a lot of them were marrying Irish immigrant women.
Well, were there very many Chinese women for them?
No, and that is one of the reasons why they married out of race. Very few Chinese women.
And was that legal in San Francisco at the time?
The interesting thing is that I think it was legal somehow, because there certainly were a number of people who did it, and I read accounts of mothers and fathers who objected to their daughters marrying a Chinese man, and then they grew to accept it. Mm-hmm. Maybe it wasn't legal, but it was not as uncommon as people think. Miscegenation in general was illegal. It was illegal in California, Chinese and whites, up until, I don't know, was it 1940s, the 1940s or something?
Amazing, isn't it?
1950s. We didn't get rid of it here in California back in the 1800s. I think it was, miscegenation was illegal. And it was illegal also in China. That it was, people got together. It's just that they were not officially recognized unions. So.
Amazing. Could you talk a little bit about your process in writing? I don't know how you do it, but somehow magically out come these fabulous novels, and I know that you must work very, very hard.
I don't know how I do it. If I knew how to have a process, I'd get this done a lot faster. It's different with every book, and here are the commonalities. And that I have a question, I have an obsession of some kind. I want to know. I have an image in mind. Usually it relates to a setting. I have some unusual situation in mind, and I write down notes in a journal, jot them down. I feel very free doing that in a journal because I can also scribble things and write notes on the side, link them to whatever through arrows. And it's not until much later that I actually commit to writing a page that will be text, would be what you would see in a book. I spend a lot of time writing that first chapter, and I eventually finish the book and the first chapter gets trashed. I don't know why even bother with the first chapter, because I know, well, I have to begin with the first chapter so I know what the second chapter is, but always that first chapter gets either trashed or radically changed. And that's because I don't know exactly what the story is until I reach the end and how it has shaped itself. And in order to capture that, I have to go back to the beginning and make sure that that form is there.
I'm glad you do it because it's magic for us.
I do. And then the other part that takes so long is that I do research along the way. I have done research ahead of time, but as I move along, I have questions. And some of them are very detailed, and I shouldn't follow up on my curiosity. Once, as an example, somebody asked me about birth control and what people did in China and also in the States. And I'd actually researched it, but it set me on another journey into finding out everything about that. And then I just put in a few things. I wanted to know what their bathrooms were like. So I had to research that and Victorian toilets, which I didn't really include. But I found out, for example, that the Chinese invented toilet paper in 400 AD. They didn't put that in there.
But we're awfully glad they didn't.
Yeah, no, you didn't. TMI for that. But it would be everything. Somebody said, well, it's going to cost X amount of money to do that. And I'd want to know what was the unit of money and what was its valuation compared to what we have today. I find out that there are many monetary systems in operation in Shanghai during that time. So I have to research everyone to see why they would use one over another. And learning then that the currency of trade was the Mexican silver dollar, even up to the 40s.
Really?
I mean, there was the Chinese yuan, and there's new money that was printed by the New Republic when the Qing Dynasty was over. But the trusted currency was the Mexican silver dollar.
Amazing. It's hard to think of Mexican currency and China together.
A lot of trade going on, a lot of foreign trade, yeah.
But the two races weren't allowed to mix, right?
Mexican and Chinese. Well, they all mixed, not in marriage, they mixed in business. In my own family, both sides of the family had people who worked in foreign trade, and both as translators, Chinese to English, English to Chinese.
Did your mother speak English when she was in China, or did she have to learn it here?
She claims she learned it in China. She claims. In fact, she was so skilled. She had a diploma saying she got a bachelor's in English. And then she was going to do graduate work. She had a student visa to do graduate work in American literature and at Armstrong College, which used to be or still is on Arguello, I think, in the city. But she never graduated from college, and she never read a piece of American literature until she read my book. In other words, she had a bogus visa, she had a bogus diploma, and her visa ran out after a certain point, and they were petitioning to stay. If this was current day, I would be one of those dream child, waiting for one of the dream children, waiting to get, an exception so I could stay.
And She was married to your father while married to the horrible man in China as well?
She was married. She had her first husband wouldn't give her a divorce. She told me she got a divorce, but I learned later she never got one. She left for the States and she married my father. She went from being a socialite to a socialite who was put in jail because she tried to leave her husband. And the stories ran in the tabloids about, the trial, being in jail, and she would testify. And she said that young girls cried for her in the courtroom, saying she was too beautiful to go to jail. My mother was very vain. She was too beautiful to go to jail. She ended up getting out of jail, and then she ran off and she joined my father and married him. She went back from being a socialite, wearing chinchilla coats, smoking, and had beautiful girls crying over her, and to going to Fresno, California, or also Berkeley, and eventually Fresno, California, a little backwater farming community back then, and hot metropolis now. And from all my Fresno friends. She was a minister's wife. He earned $50 a month and tithed 10% of that to the church, back to the church. She was out of her element. She'd never washed dishes. She'd never had to clean house. She was cleaning house to help earn 25 cents. She was crying the whole time. She let the dishes pile up in the hill. There was nothing left, and she had to wash a dish. That was her life. So when we talk about major upheaval, that was looking at the kind of life that my mother had. This book, by the way, to me, we always talk, it's about courtesans, about mothers and daughters, but really what it's about for me is self-identity. That's what all my books have been about. Mothers and daughters have figured into that because they are, for most women, one of the greatest influences of their lives. Mothers teach us what to be careful about, what to fear, what to want, how to see ourselves, and we spend a lifetime trying to get rid of those notions. And often they just are there, they're just stuck inside and we can't get them out. But there's a lot having to do with who we are, how we see ourselves, versus how the world perceives us. So say you have somebody who's grown up in a very privileged society like Violet, and suddenly she's thrown into the world of Chinese people and is considered Chinese. How does it affect how she thinks of herself? She might hang on to this notion she's an American, she still has her same privileges, she has to be respected for that, and when that doesn't work, what does she do? What does she change? What does she refuse to change? And I think we all go through exactly that in many different points in our lives. It's very, to me, it's very difficult, especially when we are thrown into situations that changes. I think of marriage as being one that is very traumatic to many. When you think about what you might be losing and changing, and you're so uncertain what that might be. I think of people who've lost fortunes overnight, and what that means, what they now have to do. Their whole world is gone. How do they remake themselves? And how do they think of themselves? What do they do that's necessary? That question is always there in the book. What's necessary? And what do we do that's necessary?
And in the opera and in all the books now that you tell us that, I think it's there.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Are there more slides that we could enjoy?
Oh, I can show you more photos of her.
I think we'd like to.
This one is the one I find most compelling. I had these other photos, but I never bothered to look at them that carefully. They were the size of a postage stamp. And once I discovered that discovered the picture of the 10 women who are courtesans, I went back and used a magnifying glass to look at all the details, and I also had the photos blown up. I notice something every time I go over this photo, using a magnifying glass and looking at it from one corner to the other. Our tendency is to look at photos just straight on, the way the photographer wanted us to see it. You look at the face, you might look at the posture. But if you start in an illogical way for viewing a person, you might start in the corner and you just go pixel by pixel across, and you start seeing things you've never noticed before. When I did that with all the pictures, I noticed I gathered more information about what was going on at the time. I colorized the photos as well, and some of the things stood out. There's a little detail right at the base of her collar, and I thought it was a necklace, but somebody said to me, no, it's a clasp that was used to close off the placket of the jacket. But then I saw another courtesan who was wearing something similar, a little bit more elaborate. And there were beads around it. And when I enlarged this thing and colorized, I saw the beads then that are right under the throat. The beads are pushed there, and then what you see is the hanging pendant. You see the bracelet that is twisted metal, and on her hand she has another one. You look at this pose. My family had told me that she was old-fashioned and quiet and traditional, a stay-at-home mom. And this is, not home. The photo, when I talked to a number of people actually study this area and write about this, professors of history, Chinese history. They have written books on courtesan culture of the early 20th century in Shanghai, and the culture was very specific to the regions. They told me that the most significant detail about the photo is the photo studio itself, that no woman went into the photo studios except courtesans. The studios were for courtesans. Now, in considering the possibility that she did it just as a lark, there are 4 of these photos over different ages. So if she did it as a lark, she repeated the lark sometimes. I was a little bit insulted when one of the academics said, just looking at the studio and her attitude, she said, I think if she were a courtesan, if she hadn't been a courtesan, she was second-class courtesan. What? And, maybe she was first class at one point, and then things went downhill a little. Here's when she was younger. And you see she has a very radical hairstyle. You see the matching bracelets again, and those are mentioned in the book. Details about matching bracelets, about clothing. And if you were to look very carefully at the bottom of the skirt of the older woman, you'd see that it's got Western pleats, and she's wearing Western boot shoes, leather shoes. This is a much later picture. Now, here's when you could call her old-fashioned, traditional, and quiet. She had become the 4th wife to a rich man named Tu, and she was pregnant there shortly before she gave birth to the man's first son. She was a negotiator, and she said, if I give birth to a son, will you buy me a house in Shanghai? And he agreed. But she gave birth to the son, and he reneged. And she was very angry, and shortly after she killed herself. But I think that it may have been an accident. It may have been she intended to scare him. She swallowed opium, but it was too much opium. And she lingered for about 3 days, and she died. But she had threatened suicide a number of times. People I talked to during this period when I was gathering more research, said that she had a very strong temper, very strong opinions, and if you did not, quote, listen to her, you were sorry later. Even though she was the first wife, the fourth wife, she was the favorite, and she had a lot of say in the house. Anyway, her feet are a little deformed. They were bound when she was a young girl, and then they were unbound later. I believe it was about 1902, the Dowager Empress made the foot binding illegal. People still continue to do it, but she said it shouldn't be done anymore. And around that period, she was about 12 when they were unbound. The little girl is my mother, Daisy. She has a serious expression. And then her mother is standing behind her. They have stripes on and white clothing, white details, white shoes, because it's the 3rd anniversary of my grandmother's mother's death. She is there at a temple. And just recently I enlarged it again, and I saw that she has puffy eyes, so she's been crying. It's clear. She's been crying. See the wider sleeves again. She's again old-fashioned, traditional. That's a larger picture. The smaller woman with the long bangs with the clasped hands, she had a very unhappy marriage to my grandmother's brother, who was always telling her she was ugly and that he had deserved a prettier wife. And when she fell ill one day, she refused to take any medicine. She said she would rather die, and she did. That's that horrible picture. Anyway, there you go. There's that necklace I was telling you about with the beads. But this woman was the most popular, the most successful courtesan of that time. And so her clothes and her jewelry are all much more elaborate, much more, you can tell, very expensive. There's one thing I wanted to also mention in this photo. That one. Do you see how dark her eyebrows were? I think she darkened them. In 1912, women wearing men's clothing, courtesans wearing men's clothing became a fad. And they would darken their eyebrows and really make them do their hair in a certain way, put on the clothes of a scholar, put on the clothes of characters out of favorite novels like Dream of Red Mansions. And men just went wild over this. So you can imagine, I used a little imagination to think about what went on in the bedroom when these women had on men's clothes and dark eyebrows. For whatever reason, maybe she didn't pluck them for a really long time, but her eyebrows look very dark to me, and very masculine in a way. And that look, I love the look of her, the look is, don't mess with me.
Right.
Anyway, those are all the
Those are great. Well, Amy, thank you so much for,
Thank you.
for this great book. Are there any questions? Ms. Potter.
Amy, you were one of the most curious and intellectually curious people I think that's ever walked the earth. And I actually mean that seriously as much as it sounded like a joke. So it was interesting that you answered the question by saying that you get obsessed with something, and I would say that you get curious about many things at the same time. And your journal is filled with many questions about many things at the same time. And I wonder how you eventually settle in on something particular to write about, because I would think that you probably have many novel stories going on at once.
Mm-hmm. Emily was saying that I have, as a fellow traveler, she's noticed that I write down a lot in my journal. And I have many ideas, many obsessions and interests, and how do I settle on something to write about? It is whatever is the one that I can't stop thinking about at night, just before I go to bed. And the one I am most, the one that I think it's urgent to know. For me, knowing who my grandmother was had a lot to do with who I was. She passed something down to my mother passed something down to me, and I think it had a lot to do with independence. Knowing your own mind, as my mother would always say, know your own mind. You know, that I should not follow the opinion of any other person except hers. But I had to judge for myself what was right and who I was, and, you know, not just because somebody didn't think that I was popular, you know, that I shouldn't think of myself in those terms. So she was very wise, but I look back, you know, now I'm thinking, okay, what if my grandmother had been a courtesan? Those are lessons she would have learned. You know, don't judge yourself by how popular you are. Don't judge yourself by what, even though people put you down or pay you only this amount of money. You know, those would have been very strong beliefs she would have had to hold to hang on to who she was in the world. So it's just that, you know, whatever question is going to be worth my spending years thinking about.
You know, once I was at a party sitting with your mother, and she was talking about the importance of a woman having her own way of supporting herself. And she was so adamant about it.
Yeah.
There was someone else at the table, a young girl, who was, she said, what are you doing this summer? And the girl wasn't doing anything. And your mother, Daisy, was quite adamant that she better go out and start learning to support herself.
Yeah, you know, she told me that from a very young age. It came in the form of you should become a doctor, make a really good living. And she wanted me to be accomplished, in other words, to be a concert pianist. But a lot of this had to do with being your own person, being strong. And so that if I got married, not when I got married, but if I got married, and I was not happy in that marriage, I could leave at any time without thinking, how am I going to support myself? That was a question that she had. Oh my God, I have fish frying. What is that? Okay, what is that?
It's just on the jewelry.
Oh, okay.
It's
Let me just, okay, how about that? All right.
Or I could do this.
No, it just sounded like fish was.
We must have Julia Child with that thing on. Julia Child was playing with her pearls.
Oh.
The little thing, and I didn't have the nerve to go up and change it on her.
Yeah.
But with you, it's not a problem.
Yeah, so she said she always believed that that was important. She made Lou buy me a gold bracelet to show that I had money. I could sell the 24 karat gold and then have money to leave him at any point. It was so hard, because it was only worth $300. Plus a bus trip to Fresno.
And yet the courtesans' jewelry was very important. That was part of the independence, right?
Yeah.
So Daisy rides again.
She was.
I see a question way back there.
I would really like to be able to see you.
Can you stand?
Oh, you would like to be able to see me. Like sorry, I was being lazy.
It's okay. No, we need to build another platform.
Oh, sorry. I can
Not
answer
your
this
fault.
way. Okay, good. Yes.
Did you obtain any jewelry from your mother that you currently wear?
Yes, jewelry that I got from my mother. You know, I wondered if any of that jewelry came from her mother. And there was a particular jade ring that was in an Art Deco style. That was had gold, a gold band that looked very Art Deco, and a very, very nice piece of imperial green jade. But the very first day that all of my mother's living children were together in the same room, her daughters from her first marriage, me and my brother, somehow that piece of jade off of the ring disappeared. It just gone. I mean, it was nowhere on the floor. I think one of the sisters stole it, but I don't know what happened to it. I still have the setting, and I have a feeling that that was from her mother, and so it's a treasure.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes.
Is your mother proud of you that you didn't become a doctor?
My mother, is she proud of me, even though I didn't become a doctor? Yes. She was happy when I was fairly successful as a freelance business writer, because my husband and I helped buy her a house, an apartment. And that really was a lot of it, that I would be comfortable enough to earn my own living, and then also that I would have enough to take care of her. And then when I wrote the book, she was very happy, because she saw that a lot of it was about her. She loved the attention, and she wanted me to write more about her. She asked that the second be just about her. So she was very happy. Yeah.
How did the women get into the life of a courtesan? I mean,
How did they get into
Yeah,
that?
did their parents sort
Yeah.
of sell them or move
A lot
them
of
in
them,
that direction?
You know,
or
this
it
was
independent?
courtesans in a continuum of the sex trade were at the top. But a lot of them got into that world by being placed there. They were sold, or they were kidnapped, or their mothers had been in the business and the daughters were raised, and then they came into that business. About 1 out of every 100 women in Shanghai during one period during the turn of the century was in the sex trade. And you have to imagine what it would be like for a woman during that period if your husband makes a business deal with a foreigner who takes off your money, and your family is left broke, then your husband kills himself. You have nothing. And you either become a beggar, or you might become a streetwalker. It was a huge problem. It is a huge problem today. I mean, you know, people always think of about human trafficking, sex trafficking of young girls and boys occurs mostly in Southeast Asia or India, and it is a big problem there. But there is something like 300,000 kids who are at risk or now part of sex trafficking in this country. And the numbers are so high because we have about 450,000 kids who run away every year. And those kids disappear. And they don't know how big the numbers are because they don't see the kids. They don't see where the kids go. And you talk to kids who are forced into prostitution, and they say the same thing, that they feel that they are now bad. Even though they were kidnapped and forced into that life, they can't go back because they're part of that world now. And so, you know, I imagine it was the same with these kids. Well, you know, it probably wouldn't have been as, you know, if a mother just said, "Here, I'm going into this business," the girl might complain, but I don't think that they would have called the police and hauled her off for, you know, forcing her child into labor like that. No. Was not a career choice for a child. Mommy, I want to grow up to be a courtesan. You know? And you know, the saddest cases, though, when you read about it, just was gut-wrenching. And I put this in the book. The life of a courtesan was briefly glamorous. It was an illusion of glamour that they had to put on for their customers. But there were girls or women, when they descended, when they had nowhere else to go, they ended up in these sheds, lying on their backs, and there would be a line of men, one after the other, coming to take them. And they would end up dying, drug addicted and dead, a very early life. And especially sad with the young girls. You know, they started at age 9 or something. And if they survived, they were drug addicts.
Can you talk about the immortality mushroom?
The immortality mushroom.
We're serving those.
The ones, these, not the ones that were for sex, the ones that are for health. Yeah. That's just really briefly mentioned in the book, that there's, one of the things they serve is specialty at the courtesan house, so, buy this expensive wine. It's just like at any restaurant, they give you the special, but, it's your anniversary, you'll want this $200 bottle of wine, don't you? It's worth it, So that's what they would do. Part of their whole thing was they'd have on the menu some specialty item. And one was immortality mushrooms. And these were mushrooms that were available for a while only to emperors. It is the mushroom I take now to control my Lyme disease, actually. And it really works. It's an amazing mushroom. I use it. It's been used for many things in Asia. That I think they're going to do clinical trials on it soon here. But right now, in Asia, they are using it, for example, for cancer. Nobody knows exactly what properties in it are useful, and I'm not saying that people take it over there and are cured of cancer, but it's something that they're interested in looking at because it has anti-tumor properties. For me, it has antimicrobial properties and anti-inflammatory properties. And the antimicrobial is the reason I don't have to take antibiotics anymore. And the anti-inflammatory is the reason my arthritis in my knees feel a lot better.
And what is the mushroom?
Register too, right?
When you buy a book and get it signed, I will let you know.
That is good
Yes.
answer. Shall we sign some books?
Yes.
Thank you so much.